Good morning. Thanks for the warm welcome. I think Jamie would be proud. So this talk's titled Practical Magento Security for Marketers and Managers. And the idea for this talk actually comes out of some challenges that I've had from my experience working as a Magento merchant for many, many years. And then also now working at Psyberware. We're a company that is a Google Premier Partner. We do ad management, but we do a lot of stuff specialized on Magento, like tag manager implementations, dealing with conversion tracking in Magento, various events throughout the site, things like that. Also a lot of feed issues. So a lot of the integration things with Google Shopping. But so yeah, why am I really talking about security when this is my background? It's really because I spent so many years on the merchant side. And before that, I ran one of the early internet providers back in the 1990s in California. And this has been a career of constantly running servers on the internet under assault. And in the Magento world, just in the last couple of years, it seems like the number of attacks on Magento merchants is going through the roof. We're seeing a lot more attacks now than previously, and things are evolving rapidly. And this is an area that a lot of people don't really talk about too much, or we get technical talks that are a little bit too technical and not useful to merchants themselves. And I'm just trying to continue the dialogue on these things and see if we can continue to educate people, inform people, and get more people to come out and actually talk about the issues that are facing merchants. So I'm going to talk today about, first of all, a little bit of a case study from one merchant in particular. Obviously, I'm not going to name names here because people get really concerned about the branding implications of security breaches. And I'm just going to use that as a way to illustrate what a typical really bad attack now looks like. And then after that, I want to get into some practical tips for what people can do in the real world to prevent these. And these are not technical tips. These really are more organizational and managerial tips, decision-making tips, because most of the security issues that we face, I think, are actually caused by bad management decisions and the implications of those afterwards. So, a little bit of background about this merchant. They're a mid-sized American company, so pretty, largest by European standards. They're not a big Fortune 500 company, but they're good-sized. They've got an internal development team. They've worked with various outside partners at various points through history. And back in 2015, they upgraded to Magento 1.9. But they had a few issues. They did a lot of customizations. Their in-house team, some of the people on the team didn't maybe do a few of the customizations in a way that was really compatible with Magento. We've all seen situations where different levels of experience on dev teams can lead to some code that's hard to maintain. They also had extensions installed from a number of places, and some of those extensions really weren't well supported. And as we moved through the 1.9 series of Magento, there were some significant attacks on the Magento system. There were some significant bug fixes and security patches, and some of those changed the underlying functionality of Magento in ways that were incompatible with some of their customizations and the extensions they had installed. They had a hard time updating, so they stopped. So let's fast forward to 2018. 2018, their early warning system alerted them to an attack on their site. They found out they were breached by a customer placing an order, getting a warning. The antivirus software on the customer's computer said, hey, maybe there's a problem with this website. Do you really want to submit this form? Okay? That's a pretty horrible early warning system, and they had to scramble to figure out what was going wrong, what went wrong with the site. So the antivirus software triggered because there was JavaScript, malicious JavaScript getting included on the Magento site. When they dug into this, they found not just one JavaScript credit card skimmer, but multiple skimmers from different criminal gangs grabbing credit cards, but not just credit cards. Some of the skimmers were also logging usernames and passwords. We all know people reuse their usernames and passwords on lots of sites, so if you get a bunch of customer usernames and passwords, you can log into those accounts all over the internet now. The attacks also, some of the attacks used MySQL triggers to reinstall the JavaScript after it was removed. So every time they tried to clean up the infections, they mysteriously an hour later showed up again. They had no idea what was going on. And thanks to a good blog post by Willem de Groot, they figured out what was going on eventually. PHP files were also modified. So the attackers had also gotten access to the file system. There were a lot of additional PHP scripts uploaded, and I think that was probably one of the original attack vectors. Some of the Magento 1.9 era software, there were some things that allowed file uploads. So there were additional PHP scripts installed that allowed remote administration, database management, database dumps, you name it. A lot of Magento core files were modified, and they were modified in a few interesting ways. So, just a few lines of code up above the Magento code at the start of the PHP file. So it allowed remote code execution if you passed it in a particularly crafted post request. But in addition to that, all form fields submitted to Magento were logged to fake image files in the media directory because those are publicly readable. So they just build these log files of usernames and passwords, credit card information, addresses, everything. Everything anybody typed into the site got logged to fake JPEG files and downloaded. Gets worse. That also logged usernames and passwords on the back end. So they had about 30 administrative accounts on the Magento site. Every one of those that was logged into during whatever period the infection spanned had passwords logged. It gets even worse. Some of the administrators had those same passwords used for SSH access to the server. So now the physical server is compromised. Some of those accounts had sudo access so they could get root. So now the machine is rooted. Okay? The attackers have now compromised every aspect of this Magento site, top to bottom. Database, file system, server, everything. Backend admin. Like a lot of companies, they didn't really do a lot with log files except want to get them out of the way because they get really large and they don't want to run the file system out of space and cause any problems with the site. So they typically rotated those log files pretty regularly. I think they maybe kept them for about a month or so and deleted old log files. So that's a problem. They couldn't figure out when the attacks even started, when the infections occurred. They just know it was more than 4 weeks ago. They also only had short-term backups. Like, you pat yourself on the back and say, we're great, we do nightly backups, we got all this stuff. But they only had nightly backups, again, going back for several weeks. They were deleting old backups because of space requirements. They didn't have any backups from a year ago. So, again, no ability to know how long this attack had been going on for, no ability to restore from any pre-infected states with any of this. Pretty tough situation. So, when I look at this, again, I don't see technical challenges there. I see bad decisions. And I see maybe not bad decisions from a malicious or willfully incompetent mindset, but people that didn't know a lot about security making short-term decisions based on the marketing needs of the organization, maybe limited budgets and so on, and a number of these decisions cascaded into a whole series of system failures. So what are the practical things a company like this could do to avoid this sort of situation? Number one is just keep Magento up to date. And I've got to say this has actually become harder for a lot of merchants in the Magento 2 era. In Magento 1, we oftentimes had just individual security patch files, and we could apply those even if we couldn't bring a site fully up to date because maybe some features changed that were incompatible with other business requirements or customizations. Magento 2, we're seeing more of a situation where security patches the security fixes are bundled in with feature releases. So if you want the latest security patches from, you go from 2.3 to 2.3.1, you have to take everything that's bundled in 2.3.1. And so if a site now is sort of lagging behind because there's some incompatibility, they don't have that ability to just easily patch a security bug. I think a big issue that happens here is a lot of merchants, particularly small and mid-sized companies, think about all of the expense involved in creating a new Magento site, and then they don't really understand sometimes that there has to be that ongoing budget for maintenance. I've seen a lot of situations like this company where they do a big development project and then they want to stop for a year and just reap the benefits of that project without investing more in the system. So they don't actually realize that they really need to keep up with every single point release going forward. So next tip I'd say is use security scanners, and hopefully better security scanners than your customer's antivirus software. There are a lot of good security scanners out there. One of the ones that's really easy that anybody can use is just going to majoreport.com, typing in your site and seeing what it says. That has been an early warning system for a whole lot of people, and it's been really helpful. Willem de Groot has done a lot of work here, continues to have a good product that he's been putting out. Talesh Separson, he's got his Psyberware product in beta that's doing a lot of things for scanning malicious JavaScript that could be installed on your site. But also there's a lot that individual merchants can do very inexpensively and easily. So you think about the situations with this company. Well, we know that people log usernames and passwords and data they want to get off the site to the media directory. How easy is it to just write a couple of shell scripts to scan through the media directory and try to find files that aren't actually JPEGs? And then, if some files mysteriously show up, send somebody an email. I mean, that's just a few lines of shell script. It's a really easy thing to implement, almost no cost. Think about all those database fields on a Magento site that could contain malicious JavaScript. It's really simple to write some shell scripts with a few simple queries to just check for changes in those and make sure whenever anything changes, somebody gets an alert. PHP files added to the core that shouldn't be there, or core Magento files, for the version that you're running that have been edited. Just a few simple finds and calculate some checksums on those files, you quickly can determine any errors that pop up and deal with those. At least you've got your good early warning system. You can catch it the day it happens. So the principle of least privilege basically just says that people shouldn't have more access than they need to do their job. They should have the minimum level of access necessary. And it's not just the minimum level of access in terms of permissions, but the minimum level of access over time. So this company had 30 admin accounts, and a whole lot of those for employees that had left the company. They were for vendors they'd worked with in the past. All sorts of things like that where the accounts were still enabled and not turned off. That sort of stuff causes a lot of issues. Another issue is a lot of times managers, the CEO of the company says, I want full access to everything inside the company. So now you have this big boss CEO that really doesn't understand technical challenges, who uses the same password everywhere with full admin rights to every system in the company. This is a huge risk. Those can be difficult conversations to have with people in authority, but they're conversations I think we need to have more. Just every account should have the minimum level of access for the shortest time frame possible, and if access is given for a project, as soon as that project is done, turn that account off. So next tip would be to protect your backend better. And there's all sorts of, so Magento has this mechanism so you can change the URL of your backend admin login to something unique to your company. And then most companies change that to the name of their company, or something else easy to guess. That's interesting. A lot of agencies will have sort of code names for projects, and they're all based on something like the names of birds or cars or something like that, so every one of their clients is a different name, and that's what they name the admin URLs, so they know how to get into the client sites. That's a problem. If you compromise a few sites and you realize some consistent naming schemes across some large development agencies, you can very quickly then take 10,000 Magento sites out there, just keep trying variations on those themes, and you're going to get them all. But beyond this, most of the time, you don't need your backend admin URL exposed to the whole public internet. It amazes me that a lot of hosting providers don't block access by default. And I think that should be the norm, blocking access by default and then enabling specific static IPs for just the vendors that are necessary to get into your site. Or obviously using VPNs can help out here as well to allow people on the public internet that do have a legitimate need to come to your site to do so. So improving password authentication, this is just huge. A lot of merchants just seem to think that if they expire passwords periodically and make you select a new one, that's good password security. And there's a whole lot of evidence to suggest that that is really bad password security. So then I just pick the same default password. I'm required to change it every month. I'm just going to put the name of the month and the year on the end of my password, so every month I change it. So this is my June 2019 version of the same password I've been using for the last 10 years. It would be much more secure to assign everybody a completely random password and tell them to use a password manager to save that on their local computer. That's far better than these easy-to-guess passwords. Obviously, you can only go so far with this, because if you do get something that's a JavaScript form skimmer that's going to log all passwords being typed into the site, having a unique password doesn't do you a lot of good. But that's where two-factor authentication comes in. It seems like just a tiny sliver of merchants actually have two-factor authentication turned on. There's good systems for this now for Magento 1 and for Magento 2, and this would solve an awful lot of problems if more sites installed this by default, and if agencies would install two-factor authentication by default. So this is the point I want to make that has nothing to do with the case study I talked about before. They didn't get hacked by vendors, but we're now seeing this happen a little bit more frequently. So you share access with an outside vendor, and their support team has credentials to log into your server. The challenge is, do you trust everybody working at that outside vendor somewhere half a world away? And there's been a number of incidents where a full admin account or a shell login with root access was shared with a Magento extension provider, so that provider could come in and install the software. And then the next day, that account was used to install malware on the site. The next day, okay? So that doesn't mean the company's a bad company, but it means there are bad actors within good companies, and that's a challenge. So this goes also back to that principle of least privilege. Minimum level of access necessary to get the job done, and as soon as it is not needed, turn it off. So I've seen a lot of Magento merchant sites with these lingering accounts that, it was for a vendor that installed an extension 2 years ago and it's still there. Get those turned off. Maybe also think about how much you really trust various vendors. Just because some extension has the features you think you need, do you want to work with that company? Do they maintain their software with really good security updates? If they haven't updated the software in the last year, is that because there have been no bugs and it was perfectly coded the first time? Or maybe is it because they're not maintaining things and not updating, not fixing things, not improving it? I think it's good to be skeptical about these things. So the next tip is to minimize the JavaScript attack surface. And this is kind of complicated. But JavaScript skimmers seem to be the weapon of choice right now. We're going to log all this form field data. We're going to get everything useful and juicy off the site. JavaScript can be installed all over the place on a Magento system. So obviously, theme files. And think about this. Did you buy a theme off some third-party theme provider site to base your new build on? And if so, did somebody actually look through that and make sure that no malware came pre-installed in the theme? What about internal designers who have access to those theme files, who are doing various design work? Again, getting back to the principle of least privilege, once they finish an initial project doing the design, do they still need access? Do you have designers that had access several years ago, and now their passwords have been compromised from all the other sites they use them on, and somebody can just log in with their credentials and edit the theme files that they have access to? Something to think about. There's database fields inside the Magento system. So anybody with access to the Magento admin backend or to database, the database, if they're able to compromise anything there, can also inject JavaScript. And we've already talked about that whole issue with triggers being used in MySQL to reinfect database fields if it's cleaned out. So MySQL trigger can be used to inject malicious JavaScript on your site. And then think about third-party tag management software or conversion tracking. All these other things that we use for interfacing and with various marketplaces or with ad management systems, any sort of tracking that we're doing. What about like Google Tag Manager? If you're using a Google Tag Manager implementation to easily allow non-developers access to inserting JavaScript tags on the site, I mean, this is actually a huge risk. And now if you've got a Tag Manager implementation that your internal security team really has no control over because that's in the purview of the marketing department, the marketing department has given access to a bunch of external ad agencies, and you have no idea who the people at those agencies are or what their level of technical sophistication is. This becomes, again, just a huge risk to any Magento merchant. So think about all the ways malicious JavaScript could get put into your site and consider all of the people at the various organizations that might have the access to do that. There have been a number of cases of legitimate JavaScript tags being inserted into sites, and then those companies get infected. They don't even know they're infected, and now their JavaScript is being used to infect Magento sites. Fascinating. Magento's strength is the ability to customize it, and it is also one of the major weaknesses. If you can minimize the number of Magento extensions installed on your site and the code customizations you've done, you will dramatically reduce the risk to a site. There are a lot of sites that have just tremendous numbers of extensions installed, and again, sometimes this goes back to marketing departments wanting this neat little feature to do this one little thing on this web page from some unknown extension provider that doesn't support their software. It's a huge risk. The more of those that you get installed all over the place, the more problems you have. On the Magento dev docs, they have a little table of typical number of extensions on different Magento sites, and one of the little stats off that is that 59% of the sites on Magento Commerce 2 have more than 30 extensions installed. And I've seen sites that have more than 100 extensions installed, and they're not even all used or enabled. It's crazy. Just cleaning that up and getting rid of everything that's not actually used is a great first step. But then also sort of going back and saying periodically, we thought this extension was just going to do great things for the company. Do we actually have any evidence that it improved our revenue in any way at all? And maybe if we don't have that evidence and it's still just running there for no good reason, maybe it's good to have a dialogue about maybe trimming some of that back out. So in that case study I talked about, they couldn't identify how long ago they'd been breached. So they had no idea how many customers had their data stolen and how many credit cards got lost. That causes some problems with legal compliance, number one, but obviously it also causes some issues with knowing what was the original attack vector. How did people initially get into the system? It's hard to say. There are multiple ways that you could get that sort of infection just across the board where everything gets infected over time. They just don't know. So retaining logs really long term and retaining backups really long term, so you can always go back to a point in time before a breach and look at what changed and quickly reinstall non-infected files. That is just, it's worth its weight in gold. And the reality is disk space is cheap now, so why wouldn't you keep backups forever? I mean, maybe you don't keep nightly backups forever, but at least keep a weekly backup forever or a monthly backup forever. And a lot of people don't really realize what's being backed up or not being backed up. So maybe a merchant thinks that their hosting provider is doing it because the hosting provider says, yeah, it's one of our core features. We do nightly backups for you. Yeah, well, hosting providers usually don't talk about the retention of backups when they're doing that. And I think it's a good exercise to go out there and to say, all right, June 19th, 2019, I want you to pull a backup of my site from June 19th, 2018. I'd like to see that now. Show me the log files from that day or that week. I want to see what was going on that date. Test it. See if those are out there. Talk to your IT team, talk to your developers, talk to your hosting provider. See what's actually being done. I'm going to wrap up with this point. A lot of Magento merchants don't actually realize that they're ultimately responsible for security, and they are. Merchants need to take ownership for security and understand that they're the ones that are on the hook if something goes wrong. It's really easy when you're sitting on the merchant side of the fence to think that your hosting provider is handling the hosting security and your development agency is vetting all the extensions being installed. And everything's being taken care of, backups are magical, and it's just a wonderful thing, unicorns are flying through the air. The thing is you can't take it for granted. We have no idea. Unless those things are written into contracts. So somebody's accountable for monitoring logs. Somebody's accountable for retaining backups for a certain period of time. If that's not documented, if that's not assigned, if nobody truly has that job assigned to them, that's a problem. And the merchant is the one that needs to make sure who in their internal and external teams is responsible for some of these key things. Who is doing some security scans? Who's getting an email if a breach gets detected, right? Who is periodically going through all the admin logins to their site and making sure they should all still be valid and that they have the right level of access? That has to be a job responsibility that somebody is accountable for and that somebody will get fired for if they don't do it. That's frequently not the case. So, take security seriously. Definitely take ownership of security and make sure that that it is getting handled.